Tonight's speaker is the Reverend Dr. Craig C. Hill, Dean of the Perkins School of Theology. Craig Hill came to SMU in the summer of 2016 as Perkins Dean and Professor of New Testament. Previously, he served at Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, where he was a professor of theological pedagogy and founding director of 2 degree programs. Prior to that, he was a professor of New Testament at the Wesley Theological Seminary. He's an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and served for a decade in various pastoral appointments, including the chaplaincy of Christ Church, John Wesley's undergraduate Oxford College. He's a native of Springfield, Illinois, and graduated from Illinois Wesleyan University, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, and the University of Oxford in England, where he completed his doctorate in New Testament history in 1989. He also served as a fellow of Yale University and a visiting fellow of the University of Cambridge. Dr. Hill is a noted scholar in theological education. Among his many publications, his most recent book, the critically acclaimed Servant of All, Status, Ambition, and the Way of Jesus, was published in 2016. To his endeavors as a scholar, as a pastor, as a theologian, and as a teacher, Dr. Hill brings his singular perspective on how an engaged mind and willing spirit inform and enhance each other. As he wrote in Servant of All, quote, "Life is an adventure, and there is nothing more intellectually adventurous than the quest for original answers to great questions." So please join me in welcoming Dean Craig C. Hill, our baccalaureate speaker.
Thank you. We all need certain accommodations in life. This is one of mine. I've long been convinced that somewhere there's a secret guild of shorter people who build these things. I think this will do. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. After nearly 4 decades teaching at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, C.S. Lewis wrote in a footnote to then the most recent edition of the Screwtape Letters the following: "We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment." Now, I've spent most of my adult life working in the university. It's an institution I love and am devoted to, but by Lewis's definition, it can, for some, be hell. For there are few organizations more rank-conscious than the modern university. But the same potential exists in any institution constituted of humans, including, let me admit it, the church. In almost any gathering of people, it doesn't take long to sort out who gets attention and who gets overlooked. And religious groups have their own star systems. In pretty much any way they might ape the wider culture's status structures, they probably do. Now, speaking of apes and dolphins and kangaroos, almost any other social animal, permit me an extended digression. You're not quite out of college yet, so. Awareness of position, rank, status is a wholly natural phenomenon. It's an adaptive capacity that helps groups to function as groups, offering, among other things, diversification of roles, protection against predators, increased food gathering capacity, assistance with rearing offspring, and social support. But there are costs as well as benefits. Some risks, such as starvation and disease, are amplified in a community setting. Most animal societies exhibit a hierarchy, which means that its benefits are not distributed equally. Animals at the top of the pecking order typically eat better, reproduce more, are more frequently and better groomed, have more opportunities to vent aggression, and in some animals at least, are safer. The opposite is, of course, true for those at the bottom. Perhaps most significant is the fact that they live under greater stress, which inhibits physical function and makes them more susceptible to disease. Strikingly, one study of loss of social status found that, quote, the pattern of changes in a subordinate baboon was identical to what occurs in humans with major depression. We are not the only ones who get down in the dumps from being on the losing end of a social interaction. Now, our hunter-gatherer ancestors might well have experienced fewer social stresses, living in small, mobile, and relatively egalitarian groups. The invention of agriculture changed all that. Cultivation of land and domestication of animals required that groups locate in a particular place. They also made possible much larger concentrations of population, and with them increased divisions of labor and hierarchy. Hamlets became villages, villages became cities, clusters of cities became nation-states, and along the way, human societies became increasingly stratified and leveled. Scientists are only beginning to understand the amazing extent to which the human brain is wired socially. Writes David Rock, quote, "Maintaining high status is something the brain seems to work on all the time, subconsciously. Even without thinking about it, we're trying to figure out where we fit into the group. Increases in status release rewards of serotonin, dopamine, and testosterone. The opportunity to increase status is therefore a potent motivator. It's a high. The desire to avoid diminished status is an equal, perhaps even more formidable influence on human behavior. Threats to status are perceived in the brain the same way as threats to survival. And drops in status are processed in the same region of the brain as those associated with physical suffering. In many cultures, including that of the first century Greco-Roman world in which the New Testament texts were written, the threat of shame was an especially potent sanction. Crucifixion was a penalty reserved primarily for slaves, and it was imposed by the Roman state upon those whom it wished to humiliate utterly. Ancient authors who describe crucifixion focus not nearly so much on the pain as the shame. So this inner desire for recognition, place, rank, whatever you want to call it, is natural. It's been around a long, long time. But natural desires are characteristically ambiguous. They help us and they help the species to survive, but when indulged without limits, they can hurt us and certainly hurt others. Now, let me take a very benign example of this: our natural desire to eat. In an environment of scarcity, the ability to store excess energy as fat is an essential survival mechanism. Fat is good, up to a point. Now, scarcity was the common lot of our ancestors. It made sense to eat as much as they could, whenever they could, especially high-density calories that they could tuck away to see them through the inevitable lean times. Now, you fast forward several millennia. For those of us with adequate means and within walking or driving distance of a Kroger or a Tom Thumb, this formerly indispensable adaptation has become maladaptive. I can get cheesecake or brownies 24/7. Our instinct has not caught up with our reality. Likewise, this drive for status serves as a survival mechanism. In times of scarcity, one's rank in the herd can make the difference between life and death. But the human species is not under threat of extinction, at least not from overpopulation. Underpopulation, sorry, yes, maybe overpopulation. Most of us live in comparative safety and relative abundance. For us, survival is rarely a matter of rank, and status hunger readily becomes maladaptive. It's uncritical indulgence leading to less, not more, life satisfaction, and countless social ills. Now, Scripture actually has quite a lot to say about this, though it's often overlooked. I'm going to focus on just a very few passages in the Christian New Testament, but it would be possible, if time permitted, to reach out and bring in a very wide range of other sources. First, though, a bit of background on context, not in this case biological context, but historical context. It's difficult to overstate the importance of social standing in the Greco-Roman world, most often calculated in terms of degrees of honor. As J.E. London put it in his seminal work, Empire of Honor, quote, Honor was a filter through which the whole world was viewed, a deep structure of the Greco-Roman mind, perhaps the ruling metaphor in ancient society. Honor was very much a public acquisition. As Carlin Barton put it, for Romans, being was being seen. Because one's status was continually scrutinized, many were, quote, afflicted with relentless low-grade anxiety. Interestingly, the Roman philosopher and politician Cicero described the love of honor as a natural drive. Quote, nature has made us enthusiastic seekers after honor, and once we have caught, as it were, some glimpse of its radiance, there is nothing we are not prepared to bear and go through in order to secure it. Or, as the poet Horace put it, glory drags all, bound to her glittering chariot, the unknown no less than the known. Glory binds us. That was the world in which the New Testament was written, and where were formed these communities of believers, some of which included both Jews and Gentiles, men and women, highborn, lowborn, literate, illiterate, masters and slaves. Understandably, but unfortunately, the church then as now had the habit of defaulting to the norms of its society, not least in the matter of social standing. The truly remarkable thing, though, is how vigorously this tendency was challenged. Most often, it turns out, in the New Testament, by an appeal to the person of Jesus, who himself had continually to challenge the misplaced social ambitions of his own disciples. So, for instance, the story we heard a moment ago in chapter 9 of the Gospel of Mark. Then Jesus and his followers came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, Jesus asked his disciples, what were you discussing along the way? But they were silent, for on the way they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. A little bit later in the narrative, it happens again. Jesus says this to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their leaders lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not to be so among you. For whoever wishes to become great must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be the servant of all. For the Son of Humanity came not to be served, but to serve. Another of many such texts was also read this evening, the foot washing story in John chapter 13. As you might know, the washing of feet was the job of the lowest person in the house. It identified you as the lowest person in the house. It enacted your low status. And so each of the disciples of Jesus had a strategic reason for not being the company foot washer. The one who did so would reinforce the other's good opinion of themselves and ensure his own inferior status. Now, most conspicuous in the story is the use of the verb know, to know. Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God and was going to God, took a basin and towel. Jesus was the only one in the room who knew who he was, and therefore the only one free to serve. By contrast, the disciples were egocentric, focused on themselves, which ironically is a position of profound weakness, bound to the opinions of others, anxious and constrained. Jesus could serve not out of weakness, but out of strength. Serving did not make him servile. Indeed, what I find most remarkable, most countercultural in the gospel accounts was not Jesus' wisdom or power, but his extraordinary humility. He made a habit of associating with common folk, with reaching out to the lowly and despised, tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, Samaritans, a tendency that did not go unnoticed by his social superiors. When presented with opportunities to impress leaders, Jesus nearly always used the occasion instead to challenge them. In short, Jesus cultivated relationships with those who could do him the least good and undermined relationships with those whose assistance might most advance him. Now, like many of you, I'm sure, I enjoy reading widely, and in my case, business books, books on science, neurology, psychology. Over the years, I found a remarkable convergence across the board of views on this very subject. For example, in Robert Greenleaf's classic work from the last century, written for business execs and titled Servant Leadership, wrote Greenleaf, quote, "Good leaders must first become good servants. Someone who is simply in it for him or herself might command others, but they will have a very difficult time leading others. On the other hand, people will instinctively be attracted to and follow someone who's committed to something larger than his or her own self-interest." Many of you might know the Jim Collins seminal book on corporate leadership called Good to Great. It makes much the same point. Collins and his team sought to determine what made some companies truly exceptional. The most important factor they found was not at all what they expected, which was, they thought, charismatic leadership. No, the best leaders over the long haul were instead marked by humility. But they were passionately committed to their company, to their cause. They invested themselves in something larger than themselves, and so were remarkably free to forget about themselves. It wasn't about them. One more example. Psychologist Sean Aker, who many of you, I assume, heard. He was here at the Tate Lectures very recently. He's a leading researcher on the subject of happiness. And his findings correlate remarkably well with those of Greenleaf and Collins. He begins by showing that success does not produce happiness. Instead, happiness produces success. And such happiness is almost invariably created socially and is a product of gratitude and generosity. At one point, he cites a study concerning the value of social support in the workplace. And as you would expect, those who receive such encouragement were indeed happier and more productive. But here's the thing, those who were the happiest and the most productive were the ones giving the social support. All of which to me is reminiscent of the very famous prayer of St. Francis, "Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, for it is in giving that we now receive." Or if St. Francis is not a sufficient authority, how about Oprah Winfrey? "Use your life to serve the world, and you will find that it also serves you." It is indeed one of the great paradoxes of life, perhaps the great paradox of life. All of us want to have significant lives, and Jesus himself never questioned that. When the disciples argued about greatness, he didn't say to them, "You fools, don't you know you're not supposed to be anything?" No. But he did reorient them as to the true source, nature, and meaning of significance. We instinctively admire and are drawn to people who give of themselves, who serve others. But at the very same time, we are bombarded with messages that tell us if only we could own this or look like that or have that job title, that bit of public acclaim, then we'd be happy, then we'd be somebody. But it's not true. Those things are cake, not bread. They are not the food that genuinely and lastingly satisfies. You have the opportunity as graduates to embrace this paradox now. Not 30, not 50 years from now, but now when it can make the most difference. If you do, the glad irony, the happy paradox, is that you will be the ones living most in the present, most fully, most joyfully, even most honorably. Let it be so. Amen.